Daniel Ricciardo's recent return to AlphaTauri made a lot of people very happy because, of course, how could you not be happy? This man right here, Daniel Ricciardo, is back on the F1 grid just about 8 months after having rather unceremoniously left the grid. I mean, no one really wanted him to leave, but he left because, well, he didn't really want to be stepping into a midfield team just to fill in the numbers. Of course, he's done that now, but with a clear and obvious route to targeting a return to Red Bull. Of course, what ended up getting lost in the shuffle just a little bit is the fact that Red Bull Racing, for all of their, let's say, top class drivers that they produce, for the number of names really that have driven for that team, they have, in a sense, had a bit of a history when it comes to doing driver swaps, particularly when you're looking at their second team or their sister team, AlphaTauri, formerly known as Toro Rosso. Now, we're not going to count the early days because, of course, in the early days, they had a habit of swapping in drivers for just half a season to see how it is that they dealt with the pressures of Formula One. But ever since 2016, and we'll get to that one in just a bit, you can argue that AlphaTauri, Toro Rosso, whatever name they were going under, did have a major history of just swapping around drivers for no good reason. And in this video, what we're going to do is go back in that history in reverse order. So by starting with the most recent episode, which is of course this one, and then we're switching to the one that was I alluded to earlier, 2016. So without further ado, let's just get things started. First off, we'll start with, of course, as we said, the most obvious one. That is, of course, Daniel Ricciardo being swapped in for Nick De Vries. Now, this one came about entirely because, of course, Nick De Vries, despite being signed just in the beginning of this particular season, he didn't really have Red Bull's entire backing. I mean, Helmut Marko, their driver advisor, did admit very clearly that Christian Horner wasn't a big fan of De Vries, and Marko had pretty much signed him just on the basis of his rather admittedly good showing in the 2022 Italian Grand Prix. Now, what happened thereafter was that De Vries, well, he was consistently unable to perform and he was consistently falling below even the very basic levels that were expected of him, of a Red Bull driver. Now, admittedly, Red Bull can be very harsh, and this is exactly what happened because De Vries, who, despite having a lot of experience in other race series, is still an F1 rookie in the sense that this was his first full season, ended up getting swapped out after 10 races officially. And in comes Daniel Ricciardo. Of course, we know he's driving for AlphaTauri with the sole purpose of eventually getting back to driving for Red Bull, whether that be next year or the year after that. But it still continues a long trend, one that even in recent seasons we saw a lot. Just take, for instance, the 2019 season when Pierre Gasly and Alex Albon were swapped from Red Bull to Toro Rosso. In fact, at that point, Pierre Gasly was the driver who was at Red Bull. He had been struggling a lot at that point, and there was a lot of pressure on him because he was not only crashing a lot, but at times even his race pace just wasn't being considered good enough because there were occasions where Max Verstappen would in fact be lapping him, and they were in the exact same car. Therefore, it was no surprise when they did in fact make the switch and Gasly was sent back to AlphaTauri, and in his place came Alex Albon, who had been impressing in AlphaTauri and who himself, by the way, would end up getting dropped come the end of the 2020 season. As we said, with Red Bull, it is always perform or perish, and if you don't perform, you're going to perish. Life really does come at you very fast. We didn't cover Albon here because with Albon, he wasn't really swapped out for anyone. He was simply demoted and the team brought in Sergio Perez in his place. That's just the brief of that. Now, Perez's seat, incidentally, himself is in danger, but that's a story for maybe another time. The peak really, if you ask me, of Red Bull and their driver swapping for their second team, Toro Rosso, came in 2017, where they had 3 different drivers being swapped in at some point or the other. In fact, if you count Carlos Sainz, because he left the team in the middle of the season, they had 4 different drivers in the same car. Now, the reason this was happening was because Kvyat, who had been subbed in to AlphaTauri or Toro Rosso in 2016, and we'll get to that story in a bit, he was having a bit of a crisis of confidence, so he was eventually dropped out, and in his place came Pierre Gasly. And Pierre Gasly at that point was being teamed with Carlos Sainz. However, Carlos Sainz ended up leaving the team because he had an opportunity to join Renault, and once he left, well, then they ended up bringing back Danny Kvyat. Yes, you heard that right. Thereafter, though, there were a few occasions where, Gasly, because he was still competing in the junior categories, there were certain commitments that he couldn't let go of. And so, in order to ensure that Gasly could race in those series, they would bring in Brandon Hartley, who had previously raced for the team as well. And Hartley would, in fact, continue to race alongside Gasly once Gasly's junior commitments was done for the rest of the season, because the team totally gave up on Daniel Kvyat. And if that sounds like a bad thing for Daniel Kvyat, believe you me when I say that Kvyat, the man, was the one who actually started this entire culture, you can say, of Red Bull chopping and changing drivers in their junior team. How so, you may ask? Well, let's finally get to that 2016 story. And what can sum it up better than this very awkward picture? Now, if you're unfamiliar with the story of this picture, what you're seeing on your right is Max Verstappen, freshly promoted to Red Bull, and on your left you see Danny Kvyat, freshly demoted from Red Bull to Toro Rosso. Both of them had switched, and it was the first time in history that Red Bull had pulled off such a switch. And considering the way it worked for them, you can understand why it is they've stuck to it, because again, at this point, Danny Kvyat's career at Red Bull was very much on thin ice. He had in fact become a bit of a, he'd gained a bit of a reputation for crashing. In fact, in 2016, he was accused of former Red Bull driver Sebastian Vettel of crashing into him like a torpedo. And then that was not once but twice in the same race. After that, his career was on thin ice. And when the swap happened, no one was really surprised, because again, Max Verstappen was someone who was highly rated even back then. And the decision was in many ways vindicated, because this one was taken before the Spanish Grand Prix of 2016. The Spanish Grand Prix, by the way, was Max Verstappen's debut race with Red Bull, and he ended up winning it. Of course, it did out of some friendly circumstances, because the Mercedes cars of Nico Rosberg and Lewis Hamilton ended up crashing into each other, both of them out of the race. Therefore, a battle for the win came down between Verstappen and Raikkonen. Incidentally, Verstappen at that point was the oldest driver, or was the youngest driver in the grid. Raikkonen, the oldest driver in the grid. So it was a battle between young and old, and it was the youngster who won out. Now, if you're wondering why it is that, Kvyat and Verstappen, well, they ended up getting linked up a lot. Bit of a funny story for you guys as a bit of an aside. They did also kind of end up dating the same woman at one point, because again, Danny Kvyat's ex-partner ended up dating Max Verstappen and is still dating Max Verstappen. Her name is, of course, Kelly Piquet. She's the daughter of former Formula 1 world champion Nelson Piquet. So, ouch. If you're Danny Kvyat, you've had some really bad luck. And to be fair to the guy, he was a decent driver. He just often ended up finding himself at the wrong place at the wrong time, developed a habit of, crashing far too much. And well, as I said, he was the man in many ways responsible for the chopping and changing that you're seeing now. A chopping and changing that continues its rather rich history and tradition, with this man now coming in. Of course, considering the fact that even Yuki Tsunoda was meant to be on thin ice, you might think that maybe he'd be the next one swapped out. Wouldn't be so sure if that was the case, because he's been quietly impressive. But given this is Red Bull, you never really know. If you found this video interesting, you can let us know in the comments below, and please don't forget to like it, share it with your friends, subscribe to the channel, tap the bell icon, leave us a comment, follow us on Instagram, Twitter and Facebook. Don't forget to download the SportsTak app, and if you're already on the channel, go ahead and check out some other videos that we've done. But for now, from my side, it's goodbye.